Thanks a lot, Frank. Thank you very much. That was a really kind introduction. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Well, Frank, thank you very much for that incredibly kind introduction. And I have to say that it's a particularly moving evening for me because I'm not only back at my old school, but I'm with the Member of Parliament who was the first person I ever campaigned for in 1983 at the age of 13. And Frank,
You were 13.
I was 13. You were only a few years older than 13. And I do want to thank you for all the support you've provided for me. I do also want to say something about being back at my old school. It doesn't give me shivers down my spine because it's a different building and it is an extraordinarily rebuilt building thanks to what a Labour government did. But I also want to say something about my experience at Haverstock because it was frankly the best education that anyone can receive. And it was an academic education, but it was also an education in life. And it made me the believer that I am in comprehensive education. And part of, I think, our challenge in this campaign, and part of, I think, the message people are responding to, is that politics is not about management. Politics is not about being a technocrat. Politics is about changing your society. And my parents taught me something very, very simple, which is a faith, really, which is that if you see an injustice in your society, you shouldn't walk by on the other side. You shouldn't just get angry. You should try and do something about it. That's why I joined the Labour Party. And that's why I joined the Labour Party at the age of 17, being asked to deliver leaflets by Jim Mulligan, who is also here tonight. I don't think I was a very good leaflet deliverer, and Jim may testify to that. But you know, that is why I'm in this party, and that's why I'm standing for the leadership. And you know, it's interesting this, because I was at a meeting in Bethnal Green and Bow, and the chair was the deputy chair of Operation Black Vote, which helps get more ethnic minority candidates into Parliament. And he said to me a phrase which wasn't his phrase, but it was really stuck in my mind since then. He said, "Power is never given." Now, in the last week, I think I've discovered what he meant, because there are lots of people in the New Labour establishment who don't want me to win this election. Now, personally, I think that means I'm doing something right. Because, you know, I've got great respect for what Tony Blair achieved for our country. I've got great respect for the government that he led and that I was a part of and for its achievements. But I'm sorry, if your idea of the future is that we shouldn't move a millimetre from New Labour, that is neither the prescription for the fair society we want, nor is it a prescription for getting back into power. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. Because it's absolutely got to be a change election for Labour, this leadership election. A change election in terms of the way we think about the voters, a change election in the way we think about policy, and a change election in the way we think about our party. Frank said in his introduction, we lost 5 million voters since 1997 to 2010. I might add, the idea that it all went wrong after 2005 is frankly nonsense, because as you said, we lost 4 million voters before 2005. But it's not about who got it right and who got it wrong, it's about thinking about the future. 5 million voters we lost. 4 million of them didn't go to the Tories, they went somewhere else. And it was the less affluent voters that we lost most of all, not the more affluent voters. And the more affluent voters went mainly to the Liberal Democrats, not to the Conservatives. Now that tells you something about the electoral map. Now there is an old New Labour view, traditional New Labour, as I've taken to calling it, which says it's all about the swing vote, the affluent swing vote that might go Tory and might go Labour. That is a profoundly mistaken view about the electoral challenge that we face. Profoundly mistaken. I tell you, I was in Bob Marshall-Andrews' former seat, which was lost at the general election. And I was knocking on doors in a council estate. And I met a guy called Steve, who's paid £6.37 an hour as a cinema supervisor. Supervisor at the cinema. Second most important job at the cinema. And he's actually now on incapacity benefit. And he said to me, you know, I was working 50, 60, 70 hours a week. Now, it so happened that Steve did vote Labour because he knew the Labour councillor. But on that estate, let's be absolutely honest about this. Most of the people on that estate would have thought, politics, it makes absolutely no difference to my life. Now, you've got a choice at this election. You can say we take those voters for granted and there's nothing we can do to win them back. Or you say, well, how about stopping taking them for granted? How about not thinking that the working class vote will always be with us? Now, of course, it's not about saying you're just going to win the election with a working class vote. It's a complete caricature of my position my good friend Peter Mandelson said that, I just wanted a dead-end cul-de-sac strategy for Labour. I once described him as a benign uncle. I'm retracting that comment. But, the idea that, Jesse Jackson had this phrase he used to use, which is that one side, he used to say about the working class vote in America, one side writes us off and the other side takes us for granted. Now, you cannot take that vote for granted now. So that's electoral strategy, has to change. It also has to change, by the way, because of the Liberal Democrat voters we lost. And Frank fought a fantastic and heroic campaign to hold on to Holborn and St Pancras in both 2005 and 2010. But we know, and it's not just in Holborn and St Pancras, but in seats that we lost, about the Liberal Democrat voters that left us. So, the electoral strategy has to change. What about policy? What kind of society? I start with the question, what kind of society do we want? I do believe this society is too unequal. Now, we did great things on child poverty, to tackle child poverty as a government, and I don't resolve from them, and I'm proud of them, and I'm proud of our achievements. But let's face the fact, this is not dumping on our record, it's the truth. Inequality was higher in 2010 when we left than in the 1950s. Now, you've got a choice at this election. You can say, well, there's nothing we can be done about that, the gap between rich and poor, it's just one of those things. Or you can say, we make it a central objective of policy in the future to tackle that gap. That's why I'm for a living wage in this election. Not just a minimum wage of £5.80 an hour, but a living wage of more than £7 an hour. Basic decency at work. I'm also for tackling the issue of high pay, because I think this goes to a fundamental point about the responsibilities that we have to each other. Now, we're good at talking about responsibilities for most people in society, bad about talking about responsibilities for the rich in society. Now, some people will say, and Tony sort of says this in his book, he says a profound mistake we made was to put up the top rate of tax for those over 150,000. Some people will say, look, that's just the old left-wing so-and-so nonsense to talk about the responsibilities of the rich. Let me just let you into a secret off the record for the Camden New Journal and the Ham and High. I was on the Andrew Neil programme a few weeks ago. You know Andrew Neil, that great left-winger, socialist Bennite. I was on the program. Let me let you into a secret about what Andrew Neil said to me. After the programme, he said, look, you're talking about top pay, he said. You don't need to be a socialist to think that someone being paid 400 times more than the lowest paid employee is just wrong and something needs to be done about it. I mean, that's Andrew Neil. The idea that means that we've sort of departed the centre ground of politics, we're back to Tony Benn, and it's all sort of left-wing nonsense. I mean, that's the point. You see, the problem about New Labour is this. It got stuck in exactly the same problem that it accused old Labour of. It didn't realise that the world had changed. It didn't realise, it got stuck in its own dogma. And that's the lesson that we've got to learn for the future. So we've got to change on inequality. We've got to change on low pay. We've also got to change on aspiration. Now, what about this word aspiration? Let's look at this word aspiration. Well, the first thing you've got to say is that the idea that it's middle-class people who have aspirations. I sometimes this thing about we've got to appeal to the aspirational middle class as if the working class is not aspirational, which is complete nonsense. It's another attempt to divide Britain. It's like the divide between South and North, that somehow people in the South love the bankers getting away with, millions of pounds, because, they're all bankers, of course, in the South of England, all being paid millions of pounds, and somehow people in the North don't have aspiration. Absolute nonsense. But what are the barriers to aspiration in this country? Well, I'm afraid one of the barriers is a barrier that we put in place, which is tuition fees. Because if I think about a kid in my constituency in Doncaster, if he or she is going to get to university, it's hard enough, frankly, to get to university. But the prospect of £20,000, £30,000 worth of debt is a huge overhang, a huge burden to people. But there is a bigger issue here, and it's a big choice for Britain, this, which is about the role of markets in our society. Because there's a quite interesting divide opening up in British politics between those people who say we should have not just £3,000 tuition fees, but £5,000, £7,000, £10,000 tuition fees, because we want a market in higher education. Now, this isn't just about higher education, this is about the role of markets in our society. Because, frankly, I don't want a market in higher education. In fact, what New Labour's problem was that we were right to embrace markets in some areas, but we never recognised the limits of markets. We never saw the limits in public services. We never saw limits in our economy, by the way, either. And you know, that is a big choice that we have to face. Now, I'm for a graduate tax. Why am I for a graduate tax? Because it says there should be a simple principle, which is the amount you pay for your higher education should be related to your ability to pay. If you're a banker, you end up paying back more than if you're a teacher or a social worker. It is a big choice, this, that we face. So on low pay, on inequality, on tuition fees, we've got to change. We've got to move on. We've got to recognise where we went wrong. And it's all very well me talking about inequality. But if I come along and say that, and then say when it comes to our party, I get to decide everything and you get to deliver leaflets, that's not much of a belief in equality. Now, delivering leaflets, Jim's looking disapproving, delivering leaflets is incredibly important. Don't get me wrong. It's incredibly important. But we've also got to realise that a living, breathing party, which all the candidates say they want, is also a party that can express its view. Why is that so important for us as a political party? Because you might say, well, look, parties are declining around the world. You know, does anyone really want to join a political party? All of that. We live in not a conservative country, but in a country with conservative institutions. Now, in order to counter those conservative institutions, you've got to have a political party that is represented on the ground. The air war on its own will not win us back power or sustain us in power, nor will it give us the policies that we need, frankly. And so we've got to change the way we think about this. And actually, we would have been a better government, not a worse government, on a whole range of issues, from housing to agency workers, if we listen more to our party. So I'm in favour of party conference being about standing ovations and balloons, but it can't only be about standing ovations and balloons. It's about having the courage to debate, not to be disunited, but having the courage to debate. And that takes me to the issue of the trade union movement. You see, the workplace is the area of politics that we've been pretty silent about, to be completely honest, in the last decade or so. And if you want people to vote for you, the idea that you don't talk about what they do for 40 or 50 hours a week, it makes me pretty doubtful that they're going to think you're relevant to their lives. And here's the real issue. We've got to stop treating the trade unions like embarrassing relatives who need to be locked in the attic, because that's never going to achieve the society we want to achieve. But there's an uncomfortable truth that we all have to face, which is that only 15% of people are in trade unions in the private sector. And that isn't because simply of legislation. That's because of relevance. That's because people don't think that trade unions are relevant to their lives. If they hear about trade unions, they hear about strikes, or they think about, you know, maybe the 1980s. And you know, that is a massive challenge for us as a political party. And you've got to rebuild this relationship with the trade unions from the ground up. MP by MP, frankly. It's not about me getting around the table with some general secretaries. You've got to rebuild this relationship from the ground up. And that is why my candidacy, I really want to warn you about this, is not the candidacy for the easy life. This is not the candidacy for let's elect Ed and then it will all be okay. Because it is a hard, long struggle. To tackle inequality in our society is a hard, long struggle. To change the nature of our labour market and give people proper protection at work is a hard, long struggle. To change the nature of our party in its attitude to civil liberties and other issues is a hard, long struggle. And I really want to say that to you, because I think part of the problem that New Labour faced was false expectations. High rhetoric, moderate policy. It's better to be honest and open right at the start about the scale of challenge that I think we face to create the kind of country we need. And the biggest challenge we face at this leadership election, I think, is to have confidence about our values. Not to listen to the siren voices who say, you can't change, you can't be different, you're never going to win that way. Because those siren voices, I think, will actually lead us to defeat. And we've got to ignore the siren voices. And you've got to remember this, that power is never given. It is a struggle. But I honestly tell you that as this campaign has worn on, I have become more convinced that our message is right. I have become more convinced that actually there are millions of people out there who are yearning for a vision of a fairer, a more equal, a more just society. Many of them voted Liberal Democrat at the last election. I think they can become our home. I think we have a chance to make Labour the home of a progressive majority in this country, but only if we have the courage to change. If we do that, we can create a party, a movement, and a country we can be proud of. Thank you very much.